Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Corey Kizilevich, and I'm the Marketing Director with Concord Direct. I'll be moderating today's conversation. We are really excited to share this information with you because we know it can transform the way you build relationships with your donors. And as nonprofits still labor to get more out of digital communications, what we're talking about today will truly be the next evolution of donor cultivation. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today and then turn it over to them to walk through the objectives, the agenda, and the presentation. First is Peter Genuardi. Peter is the Executive Director of Digital Services at Concord Direct. Peter joins us by way of Merkle, Convio, and his own agency, Strength and Members. He's been working in digital strategy for more than 20 years with clients such as the National Wildlife Federation and the Komen Breast Cancer Foundation. Also from Concord Direct is Strategy Director Carla Chadwick. Carla grew up in the direct response fundraising business. Her mother was actually one of the industry pioneers, and she's worked with some of the most well-recognized clients of her own. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Smithsonian Institute, NAACP, Habitat for Humanity, and quite a few more. And finally, joining us from Countable is Michael Brodsky, Vice President of Product Development. Before Countable, Michael worked with Forward US and even the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies in Tel Aviv. He's a published author and a distinguished scholar with degrees from the London School of Economics and Washington University in St. Louis. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Peter Genuardi. Peter.
Great, thanks Corey, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to share information with you today. We'll also make sure that we share with you not just a bunch of content about what we think about things, but really one of the critical pieces to this webinar was the work that we've done to pull together a ton of examples to share with you. When we put on webinars, we really push ourselves to make sure that as we communicate with the folks who are interested in these topics, that we're sharing lots of real examples. So today, guys, we've put together a series of objectives. You'll see them on your screen in just 1 second. After attending today's webinar, we want to make sure that we're delivering real value to you. So by the end of this webinar, you should be able to describe the value exchange that lies at the foundation of direct-to-consumer marketing. We believe that you'll be able to describe the traditional approach to value exchange, and we'd like to introduce you to a new, more valuable and generous version of value exchange. We'd also make sure that you can sort out how the role of generous content, this new approach that we're developing towards cultivation, can be applied to your program. And then we also, and most importantly, I think from our perspective, we want to be sure that as we talk about adding cultivation content or other kinds of engagement into programs, that you feel good about understanding the relative time and effort it takes to create these things. And so we want to provide to you a series of ideas that you'll be able to use at your organization to produce more interesting, valuable content for your audience. And finally, we want to be sure that by the end of this session, you've got what you need to start thinking about how to apply these concepts to your program. So we're about 2/3 of the way through introductions. We'll then talk a little bit about the new cultivation, what we're trying to do, why we think this is unique and different in the realm of direct response. We'll provide a ton of examples, and then we'll talk about, finally, how to apply these concepts to your own organization. We'll obviously have some time for questions and answers. We're also going to do a poll in a couple of minutes, and you'll see a couple of questions pop up on your screen in just a second. Before we ask you guys a little bit about yourselves, I just wanted to introduce our organization. We are Concord Direct. We're a 60-year-old direct response firm. This is our mascot, Harvey here. We basically provide integrated direct response marketing services to folks who are marketing by direct mail, through multiple digital media, and everything in between. Our team works hard to provide everything from analytics and strategy to creative and campaign management, and obviously production of campaigns, whether that's direct mail or digital, email, web, social, advertising, and that sort of thing. We work with a number of organizations that you may recognize. These are, they kind of run the gamut from human services to human rights to health, as well as hunger charities. We work with organizations of all shapes and sizes. So many of these organizations raise millions, if not tens of millions of dollars a year in direct response. Some of them raise, several $100,000 to $1 million every year. We've adapted these techniques based on our work with these organizations. And so I think when we get to the question and answer section, it'll be a great time for folks to ask about their organization's particular work or the size of their organization or their budget so that we can try and bring some ideas to the table to be supportive in that way. As soon as I advance the slide, I'll turn things over to Michael for just a second to talk a little bit about the team and the work that they're doing at Countable.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Peter. And it's really nice to be here with y'all. My name is Michael. I work with Countable. We're one of Concord Direct's partners, and I had been working really closely with Peter and co for a little bit, for quite some time now. Countable is a civic technology startup. We were founded about 4 years ago, duly headquartered out here in San Francisco, where I'm calling from today, and then out in Washington, D.C., with the underlying intention to try to lower barriers to civic entry and political participation. The idea is people really care. The underlying assumption that we have is that people are not apathetic. People want to engage. They just so often don't know how, or don't know how, don't know that they can, or don't know how to meaningfully express themselves relative to the civic causes that they really care about. And so we've dedicated ourselves over the course of the past 4 years or so to building digital product that makes it easier for people to understand and engage with the civic initiatives that they care about. This manifests in just a couple of different ways. There's initially sort of when we were founded, we really got started with a cost-free consumer platform that made it really easy and accessible for anyone to be able to identify the civic issues that they care about and then take action. And then the other sort of side of the company, which is developed subsequently over the course of the past few years or so, really hinges on developing products that we can extend out to our different partner organizations and initiatives in order to help them meaningfully engage their donors and supporters and audience members, retain them, and deepen their involvement. So we do this in just a few different ways. If I had to boil down the sort of core principles of everything driving Countable, I'd say that it really hinges on notification, information, and action. We start by making it really easy for our partners to be able to programmatically reach out to their audience members in segmented, thoughtful ways that really help cut to the core of the issues that each of their individual supporters care about. The next thing that we focus on quite a bit is content. The idea is that content can more meaningfully drive action than most things out there, and it's perfectly aligned with everything that Peter was alluding to just a little bit earlier about the new cultivation and trying to provide more value. And then the third thing is providing opportunities for meaningful engagement. So often, speaking for myself at least, I've been pretty civically engaged for a long time, and I've always found it a little disheartening when there's an initiative that I really care about, but I feel like I can only get involved in a cookie cutter kind of way. And not that that isn't worthwhile, and not that I haven't done it, but it's always really nice to be able to take more action and take more personalized action, to do something that's unique to me, that my colleagues or my neighbors can't do. And so that's the third sort of pillar of Countable's focus. With that, why don't we turn it back over to Peter to get to know y'all just a little bit better.
Great. So thanks, Michael. In the next second or so, you should see a quick little poll pop up. We'll have the poll live for just about a minute here. As we dive into the material today, it's really helpful for us to know what your primary role is with your organization as it relates to direct response. Clearly, if you're like any of us, you wear multiple hats. We'd love to know what your primary hat is. We'd also like to understand a little bit more closely the top medium or channel that you work on as it relates to direct response. Whether you're working with direct mail or purely online. In this case, online, we're referring to on-site or just web-based content or promotions. And then obviously email and social are pretty self-explanatory. So in just a second, Corey will accept all the results and publish them back out. And that'll just give us as presenters a good sense of where we need to focus the conversation for today. How are we looking, Corey?
We're almost there. I'll give it just a few more seconds for the final people to count their votes.
Great, thank you.
All right, last call. and sharing results.
All right, great. So looking at this, it looks like a pretty good division of role. A lot of folks focusing on creating the strategy for their program, as well as the programmatic aspects of what happens on a day-to-day basis. And then clearly a significant number of folks are really those in the weeds of the tactical and practical aspects of a program. So that's great to know. And then as we look at people's primary medium over here, we're looking at a lot of folks focused on email, obviously. And then clearly folks split across some of the other online disciplines and several folks working on direct mail. So this is a great, I think, distribution of what folks are working on and is really well aligned with the material we prepared for today. We're going to do our best to make sure that as we describe things, we're doing it in a way that makes sense, no matter which of those media or programs you work on. Corey, do I have control of the screen? I'm trying to advance, but I appear to be stuck again. There we go. All right, so I wanted to spend just a few minutes laying down some of these key concepts. I think if you're like the rest of us and you've worked in direct response for several years or even several decades, we can probably agree that there are some key fundamentals here. I wanted to get us all on the same page and then talk about how we're trying to change the way that people look at cultivation. Quite frankly, if you've been in the industry for more than 5 minutes, you know that you will be successful if your program can do all of these 4 things. Those are attract leads, convert them to donors, increase their value, and don't let them leave. Quite frankly, if you're getting into the direct response industry, the advice that I would have to give anyone would be, look, if you can do these 4 things, you will be successful for decades. Really, at the heart of direct response marketing, we look at predicating all of the work we do on a value exchange. We give people value. In turn, they give us donations. They also volunteer, write to Congress, or participate in programmatic things. But really, at the end of the day, it is a very simple value exchange. As we look at how value is exchanged between an organization or a company and the consumers or supporters that they are trying to cultivate and convert, we've seen a massive growth in the way that value is exchanged in the last 15 or 20 years. A lot of us will remember the days when we were looking at direct mail and maybe direct response TV, a little bit of telemarketing. With the advent of digital media, we're able to look at lots and lots of additional touch points in which we can get in front of folks to exchange value, whether that's delivering value to them or getting them to provide value back to us. Maybe 15 years ago, it was really exciting to have a donation form on our website. Today people can give to our organization through Facebook or other channels like CrowdRise and that sort of thing. The same is true with advocacy. It was really hard to have people communicate with their legislators by letter, then by email and web form, and now with folks like Countable communicating with their legislators by recording video in much more rich ways. We also want to be cognizant of the fact that value of a relationship with someone fluctuates over time. Hopefully it's always growing, and hopefully it's always up and to the right. But as we look at the duration of our relationship with someone, we go from the day that they don't know who we are to the day that they become a legacy donor or someone leaving us money in their estate or their will. And then there's everything in between. And so as we think about exchanging value, we want to be sure that we're focused on making sure that it's always going up and to the right. As well, we're cognizant of the fact that it happens in many, many different places. Typically, this is a traditional approach. Most philanthropies, this is going to sound a little harsh, but most philanthropies have a fairly undifferentiatable offer in that we're always asking someone to give us money because we're providing some kind of benefit to the public, whether that's saving the whales, helping immigrants, lowering taxes, feeding low-income adults, funding artists, protecting your privacy and civil rights. Really, at the end of the day, I would say that the vast majority of offers from nonprofits are undifferentiatable in that we're asking people to give us some money so we can move the needle a little bit in one direction or another. At the end of the day, too, that makes me a bit nervous because as I'm working with an organization that's doing work to feed low-income adults, I'm also competing with lots of other organizations that are asking people to provide money to improve the lives in a particular area of the country. What we really want to do is get away from this if you will. My 8.5-year-old really is kind of in this traditional approach today. All she does is ask me for money, by and large, right? She gives me a hug here, a hug there, a pat on the back. But at the end of the day, her approach to getting things out of me is similar to the way that a lot of organizations approach their direct response programs. Gimme, please give me. Why aren't you giving to me? I'm expecting you to give to me. And what I'm suggesting here is fairly straightforward, and that is that when we take this approach of primarily sending people appeals, we really are not delivering a ton of value. We might scratch that itch of helping fulfill some philanthropic need they have to make the world a better place, but that's about all we're doing. I would also suggest, too, that as we look at the way that cultivation has happened in the last 40, 50 years, as we have focused primarily on direct mail, we know that direct mail is very expensive. And so when we send a direct mail letter to someone or a package, we're asking for money. They are typically appeals. They are typically well crafted. They are beautiful. They have lovely outer envelopes. The response devices are cool. If we're lucky, somebody gives us some labels or a nickel or $1 to send back. And cultivation and stewardship typically take a back seat to that kind of fundraising. We find that when folks push cultivation messages, even today, a lot of the time when they do it, obviously it doesn't make sense to do it very often by direct mail because that's expensive, but even doing it digitally by email or web content or social content, by and large, we find that the answer to this question is really all of the above. So cultivation and stewardship messaging, in many examples, is mostly about our organization. It's still resource intensive and expensive because Peter has to write an email from scratch and he has to go write the blog post. These are also often the last things that we think about, right? We're measured on campaigns today. We need to be generating revenue. And so because we're focused on that near-term objective, a lot of times cultivation are kind of, left to the wayside and are always, or very frequently, the last few things that we think about as we're developing our program. So here's our alternative. We, for the last 5 years, have been working on an approach that really has generated significant revenue growth for organizations that have adopted this approach. The new cultivation is really something that we have incorporated into direct response programs across the board. So when we come in and take a look at a program and the organization is by and large just sending out appeals by direct mail or email or even their paid social advertising, we find that the program results across the board can be improved when we look at things like making sure we're delivering value directly to the donor. We try to make sure that it is baked into our program from the start. So as we develop an annual budget, we start to look at a line for cultivation that is value focused. We also insist on making that cultivation communication personal and donor focused. Again, too often I read emails from organizations that I support where they're telling me about all the great work they're doing, but they don't put me at the center. They never thank me in a way that is personal, that says something like, hey, last year we were able to feed 10,000 seniors in the Denver metro area. Thanks to your gift, of $100. We were able to, feed 25 more people, and that's really important. Thanks for being on this journey. Instead, the focus is primarily on the organization's results, and the donor takes a back seat. And then the other piece, as we've asked organizations to invest more in this cultivation, it's become critical that we make it affordable. Again, the first time I ever pitched this to any of the organizations we work with, their first question is, how much is it going to cost? Clearly, the production and creation of valuable content is not free. And so what we have really focused hard on doing as we've developed these programs is making sure that we can include content that is valuable, but also resource unintensive, if you will. And so what I'd like to do is take a second here just to pause and make a very important point. A lot of the time as we talk about delivering value to folks, a lot of people will ask us, that cultivation content sounds expensive. I'm pushing out a bunch of blog posts already. And I would say that the content that you have published through your organization, or maybe direct response letters that you're upcycling into web content, or stuff that your programmatic teams are doing, is super valuable. But I think part of the reason why we feel so good about partnering with an organization like Countable is that they drive engagement. And so while content is valuable, getting someone to become part of a larger community or being able to have an impact on policy and the things that are going on in the world becomes even more influential in their decision to support an organization down the road. So I'm going to stop talking for a second and turn things over to Michael to talk a little bit more about some great engagement options.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I would echo what you just said. I think that in Countable's experience, pairing content with opportunities for meaningful and personalized action is the most efficient and profound way of deepening audience engagement and investment with one's cause. So there are a handful of different ways that Countable goes about facilitating this. The first thing the first sort of product that we provide that helps do this is our lawmaker messaging tool, or our public official messaging tool. You can see it represented on the screen in front of you just below where it says lawmaker messaging. The idea is to create a very lightweight embedded product that doesn't live on Countable, is hosted on external partner sites, that can be slotted into any piece of content that our partners are producing in order to help make that content actionable. If there's a press release that references a public official or a lawmaker, don't just ask the audience member to consume that piece of content, but to take action and contact the relevant stakeholder. If there's a blog post or a new piece about a piece of legislation that you guys are supporting, or a relevant civic issue that's come up in the news, maybe childhood separation or something that regent of a local university said, make it actionable and empower the audience member with the opportunity not just to read, but to really sort of plant a stake in the ground and feel like they have a sense of purpose. The second tool that we tend to work on in conjunction with our partners in order to facilitate deepened audience engagement, you can see off to the right of this frame here. And this is our video testimonial tool, or our user-generated content tool. One of the things that we've learned over the course of the past few years, facilitating quite a bit of audience engagement in conjunction with our partners, is that people really love the opportunity to contribute something uniquely meaningful that only they can contribute. And video is incredibly powerful in this context. It's one of the reasons that FaceTime and Instagram and Snapchat have taken off. And connecting the power undergirding that with some sort of civic initiative is something that's really only begun to just get underway over the course of the past couple of years, but it's something that yields tremendous opportunity to meaningfully engage audience members. Firstly, because when you contribute something, if you record a video in support of an organization or an initiative or a campaign that y'all are running, you're not just signing a petition, you're not just doing something that everyone can do, but you're putting your face and your inflection and your voice and your story behind that in an incredibly personal and an intimate way. And it enables you to share something with the partner organization that the partner organization can leverage for broader impact in order to optimize broader engagement and donation and investment. Similarly, it's a really wonderful way of showcasing videos and content to audience members. One of the really nice things about user-generated content and video content in particular is not only are you able to solicit it and then garner video content that can be leveraged for broader impact, but you're able to show that content to each of your audience members. And one of the other things that we've learned sort of in this business over the course of the past few years is that if there's one thing that people really enjoy, it's watching their peers talk about issues that they care about. It's a really wonderful way of surfacing value, showing, not telling, and helping connect your audience members with other members of community. So that's a perfect segue into the third thing that we try to help facilitate, which is community growth and development. Something that's often lacking in the partner, in the sort of initiatives of the partner organizations that we tend to work with, is an emphasis on community connection. And one of the things that we found is that connection is everything when it comes to deepening investment with audience members. That's why we try to help facilitate connections between your audience members and their lawmakers, or the relevant stakeholders in the community, or similarly, try to help facilitate connection and development between your audience members, and others, and other folks within your audience. So one of the platforms that Countable has developed and leverages in conjunction with a lot of our partners makes it really easy for people to share posts and comments and viewpoints and ideas and perspectives relative to your cause and organizational initiatives with other folks in your community. And then we have cultivated the product such that we only allow for positive affirmation or engagement. So there's no downvoting, there's no direct sort of responding to a message that or a post that someone has created. It's all positive and affirmative. And the idea is, let's meaningfully connect people with other people. Let's prove to your audience members that it's not just them, that they're joining a chorus of already existing voices. And that's something that's really helped spur sort of continuous and deepened engagement with our partner initiatives. And then the fourth thing to sort of tie it all back together is valuable content. But not just any sort of content. Like Peter was alluding to a little bit earlier, the content that's worked most effectively for us in a civic context is content that's highly targeted and personalized, that adopts a citizen's perspective. It's not just about a broader issue or about the work that y'all are facilitating, but it's really about how that work affects the individual. And then similarly, content that's really distilled down into two different things. Firstly, digestible language that's really easy for folks to engage with. So often the initiatives that we're all working on and undertaking are, have to do in some capacity or another with public policy or some kind of pseudo-intellectual thing that's really difficult for people to latch onto and fully understand, because they don't work in the space in the same way that we do. And even if they care about it, they may not sort of be familiar with all the lingo, and it's difficult to sort of communicate value in a way that can really resonate with people. And so we help produce content for our partners that really focuses on that. And then I'd say the second thing is content that builds in actionable opportunities, that has hooks within the piece of content proper, that makes it, that surfaces opportunities for people to get involved in a meaningful and personalized way, and then pairing that with the actionable product that we just were talking about a couple of minutes ago. With that, let me turn it back over to Peter to talk a little bit about the new cultivation in action and walk through a few different examples of how this is playing out.
Thanks, Michael. I just wanted to piggyback on something. There are a number of folks that we work with that they work on issues where they are not they're not particularly focused on lawmaker messaging. A number of organizations, make a lot of change, and they don't communicate or advocate for their consumers or the supporters to talk to members of the legislature, whether it's local or national. I would say that, though, a lot of times we're able to use a very similar mechanism to get folks to connect with an organization and their peers. A lot of those things look like people signing pledges, whether it's pledging to reach out to one of their neighbors who might be an isolated senior citizen, whether it's committing to feed their kids healthy lunches. There are a number of ways that we can use these types of advocacy style engagements to get people more closely connected to our cause, even if it doesn't affect policy. But if it means that someone has come to our website and makes a pledge to change their attitude or behavior or knowledge, it just becomes really important from an engagement perspective, regardless of whether your organization engages in lobbying or trying to affect public policy. Before I dive into those examples, and I promise we'll spend a lot of time on examples, it occurred to me that I skipped a very important slide. And as we look at this new cultivation, we're certainly not talking about just sending out more emails or publishing more Facebook content. We certainly don't want to just shove content out to people, because pushing content out for content's sake really doesn't add a lot to conversion rates and engagement over time. We've really identified 5 or 6 ways, in addition to those things that Michael just talked about, that deliver value to your audience. Of course, you need to know your audience, right? Are they older folks? Are they younger folks? Do they have children? Do they have pets? Where are they spending their money? What's going on in their lives? Based on that understanding, we have found that some key ways to deliver very strong content that increases the value of what you're delivering to them, whether it's about your organization or the issue your organization works on or something very closely related. These are the ways that we find are most successful. In a number of cases, we've figured out how to solve people's everyday problems, like training their dog or figuring out how to eat more healthfully and those sorts of things. We also find that really putting time and energy into entertaining folks, making them laugh or telling them a story, or better yet, a really compelling story that has some suspense in it, keeps people engaged and interested, and all of that really counts as value. We've also found that connecting people to their community, whether it's a local community and helping them take action in a particular geographic area to improve the lives of kids who are in high school or older adults, or folks whose access to healthcare is pretty low, becomes important, but also can connecting people with a virtual community. And so for a number of the organizations we work with, we often drive people to things like Facebook posts to share their favorite memory of a charismatic individual, whether that's maybe the executive director of the organization, but even people who are much more broadly connected. As an example, we work with an organization that helps young children. And so we ask people who were receiving our email on the anniversary of Mr. Rogers' death to come to a Facebook post where we shared a great image and quote from Mr. Rogers and share their best Fred Rogers memory. We saw really strong engagement there, and the downstream campaigns where we asked for money performed very well. We also think it's important to help folks understand their sense of, give people a sense of purpose. So to the example I gave before, it's one thing for an organization to say, our organization fed 10,000 folks in the Detroit metro area. It's another thing to say that we were able to do it because, Peter, you were supporting our organization, whether it was through a gift or through volunteering. And then finally, that first example that we started with, giving people that philanthropic outlet. When people feel compelled to make a difference in the lives of the people in their community, to protect the environment, to lower taxes, of course, we want to be able to provide them with that opportunity as time goes on. So what I'm going to do is dive into a couple of key examples here, and I'm going to ask Carla in just a second to jump in as soon as I cover the first couple. Some of the programs that we are most proud of have really grown in terms of revenue over the last 5 years. One of these great organizations is the Seeing Eye. They're a New Jersey-based organization that trains seeing eye dogs and provides them to people with visual disabilities all over the country. One of the things that we developed was this really great guide based on what they do to help people who have just gotten a new puppy, train the puppy, get it housebroken, make sure it eats the right things, make sure their house is puppy-proofed. We sat down with these guys and said, look, 7% of Americans actually know someone with a visual disability or is blind. Quite frankly, close to 50% of Americans own dogs. And so given that we have a much broader audience, if we try to attract people who have an affinity for dogs, we can hopefully pull them onto our file and then convince them of the benefit of their support and engagement with our organization. It started with the fact that they just adopted a dog or brought a puppy home, but leads them to understand the role that these dogs play in improving the lives of others. And so we've converted a significant number of those folks who've come on the program into donors. Basically, this is a PDF guide. If you were to search, I got a new puppy on Google, chances are you will see an advertisement for this publication powered by the organization's Google grant. It would drive you to a landing page. You would give us your first name, last name, email address, which are required. And then we would also ask you to voluntarily offer us your postal address. You'd be surprised, we capture a ton of postal addresses through that form. But once you download this PDF, what we do is send you a 10-part welcome series. The first third in this formula focuses on delivering value. So they probably, the messages will point to page 15, which is focused on eating, page 30, which is focused on house training and that sort of thing. The second third then start to shift into describing the organization and the supporters' role in supporting one another. And then the last third of the emails that we send in that 10-part welcome series ask people to convert, whether it's making a gift, becoming a monthly donor, or doing something else of value to the organization. The one other thing I wanted to mention about the Seeing Eyes program that is unique is this very high entertainment quotient, if you will. When we first started working with the Seeing Eye about 5 years ago, their email program was really interesting, but I would say not entertaining, in that the messages came from a generic corporate voice. They were typically updates about what was going on from the organization's perspective. What we've done in the last 5 years is developed what we call the Future Hero program. So where once we were talking to supporters through the voice of some nebulous narrator who was nameless, oftentimes faceless, what we would do now is actually develop a series of characters that are fictional characters. Because when I tell you that for the last 3 or 4 years, people have been receiving emails from Mickey, Sarge, and Gabby, 3 of the Seeing Eyes dogs, it will kind of, I describe this to a lot of people and it blows their mind that the response rates and the fundraising growth when people are hearing from these quote unquote dogs as ambassadors for the organization has been off the charts. And so I just included a couple of email examples here where you can see that we use the dogs frequently. We try to entertain people with things like Star Wars or other common cultural touchstones. And then we also deliver really great information about the folks that the organization is helping. Obviously, the people who own these dogs, whose lives have been changed for the better because they enjoy a greater sense of freedom. This is really a good example of how entertaining folks can deliver a ton of value and drive people into deeper engagement with an organization. Carla, do we have you on the line? I think you're there. Oh, sorry, I had one more example that I was going to show quickly. Our friends at Franciscan Mission Associates, they do a lot of work around the world to build mission churches and train seminarians, has developed a very similar program to attract people into the program. A lot of times, you know, there's an audience that is interested in what we're doing that is fairly narrow, but the value we can provide to folks attracts a much broader audience. And they've done a great job of that here by virtue of developing a series of prayer guides that are focused on the saints' lives as well as praying the rosary. And they've developed with us a program where we're looking for folks who may be in the midst of a crisis or something going on in their life. They want to develop spiritually and find some comfort. And so based on the search terms, we'll use their Google grant to basically put ads in front of folks to drive them to download these rosary guides and these other prayer and spiritual materials. And then we welcome them onto the file and cultivate them into donors to the organization. And I would say that this organization, this is probably one of the critical nuts that we cracked with them a couple of years ago because it has really driven some very strong engagement as well as revenue growth over the last 3 years. Okay, Carla, I think I hear you there. I'm going to jump to the next slide and let you talk a little bit about the work that you've done here.
Hi, everybody. So the examples that I'm going to show are from my previous position when I was the Vice President of Digital Fundraising at Covenant House. And for those of you not familiar with Covenant House, it is the largest provider of shelter and services for homeless youth in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. But from an acquisition message, you would be surprised to find out that that message alone was not a good hook for acquisition. Partially because we're dealing with kids who are 16 to 21 that can, a lot of people are saying, well, at 16, I already had a job. And there was a lot of obstacles standing in the way. And so I marched over to the advocacy department, which we did have one, and said, look, what are the core issues that we are advocating for? And found out that one of the biggest initiatives one of the biggest issues affecting homeless youth is trafficking. And it makes sense. If you think about it, you're going to grab a kid off the street that nobody's going to miss and nobody's going to report to the police. And so all of a sudden we had an advocacy program because it was such an important, relevant message. And for us, it was a great way of connecting people who wanted to change. I mean, trafficking of children is a pretty disgusting crime against humanity, and people were naturally inclined to lend their voice to it and want to advocate. And then once they took this action, we were able to pull them in to a broader conversation about homelessness. And you'll see on the next slide, what we did was same thing as earlier examples is, we would use advocacy petitions as a way to get people to provide us with their name, address, email, and zip code. I really wish we had actually known about Countable when I was at Covenant House. It would have been actually a great match. We used other third-party lead gen tools for our advocacy efforts. But what we found is that these petitions were, one, not only valuable to our organization, but two, they gave our new leads an immediate sense of connection and impact. Because unlike puppy training guides and things like that, we tried value proposition tangible items, and they just didn't work. We had guides for raising a teenager, guides to talking about your kids about drugs. We even did anti-trafficking pamphlets to try to get parents to know the signs of trafficking, and nothing was working. But we found that if we just gave people a sense that they were making an impact, that for us worked really well. And what we found is that it created a pipeline of engaged prospects for our organization. So these people who signed petitions, who wrote to their local senators and congressmen, were so much more likely to become donors through proper cultivation and welcoming messages, much more so than any other lead gen we were doing at the time. And of course, it guided our communication stream because it automatically set up a follow-up cadence. And we found that the more connected we made people feel to not only the issue, but their signatures. So what was the impact of this legislation? You know, did it pass? Did it not pass? If it passed, what did it mean to our kids? How was it going to change homeless kids across the United States? And then, of course, it started to build this case for giving, because we could basically, we all know that there's only a certain amount legislation is going to do. Private philanthropy is still the way to fund many of the problems in our country. So you'll see on the next slide that, you know, we had a natural hook because we did have an advocacy department. We did have concrete legislation that we were supporting, but a lot of you on the call may be saying, well, what if my company, my organization doesn't have an advocacy department, or we don't stand behind specific legislation? Of course, that's always going to work the best, but there are definitely examples of ways that you can get people to pledge their support without it being in support of legislation. So for example, people can pledge to walk to work for a week and donate their bus fare. Or you can have them become socially active for a period of time to raise awareness of a key issue that is important to your mission. Or you can have them advocate for you. Even if your organization is not advocating for a specific topic, doesn't mean you can't ask your constituents to say, I'm going to write to my local official and ask for more funding for my schools. So there's many ways, and I think we all are aware that one of the greatest pledges was the Ice Bucket Challenge, where people pledged to take part in this challenge and then pass it forward to 5 other people. So you're only limited by your imagination in terms of engaging people and onboarding them through a pledge scenario. So the other times that we've used cultivation has been in renewal. So very often, I think, you know, and it was interesting that so many of you said that you were primarily focused on email. And I think kind of what happened with email is kind of like Peter's 8-year-old daughter. You know, we sent out an email and all of a sudden we made a lot of money. We're like, woohoo, let's do that again. And then we did it again and woohoo, it made more money. So let's just keep doing it. And all of a sudden we realized that for many of us, our email cadence was entirely about asking for money, but we're not faced with the production cost that direct mail is. So we don't have that need to every time we hit the send button have an ask. And if anything, it was starting to hurt us as an organization, and our unsubscribe rates were going down, our open rates were going down. And I said to my team, I feel like our email is like giving somebody the last chapter of a book, because they're going to open up and know that we're going to have an ask for money. So why open it up? Because we've given them the last chapter. So I said, you know what? We had found a really, really interesting young man who was a boy in our shelter who for his entire life, his parents said to him, they hated him, they regretted having him, they wish he would just run away. And the day he turns 18, they were going to kick him out of the house. And so he had a miserable, unloving upbringing. And then he turned 18 and they got in the car and drove to New York City. And he's thinking, oh, they're taking me out for a birthday dinner. And they went to Times Square, opened the door, and kicked him out with a knapsack and the clothes on his back and left him in New York City. And he lived for an entire year on the streets. He would go to the library every day and read books because he loved to read. And then he'd find soup kitchens. And then at night, he would sleep wherever he could find some place that felt safe. And then one day, a police officer found him and told him to go to Covenant House. And it was such a compelling story. And I was like, there's no way we're going to get this into 200 words. You know, once we met this guy, you just wanted to hear everything about him. And so we decided to tell his story in a series of like chapters in a book. And they literally were cliffhangers. At the end of one email, it said, stay tuned for next week's email update on Josh, and we'll tell you what happened next. And it was a series that ended with the fact that this kid loved books so much that he got a scholarship to college and was like going to graduate at the top of his class. And so when we asked for that money poured in. I mean, it surpassed any campaign we had done short of a Christmas year-end campaign, because people felt so connected to this kid after 5 weeks of following his journey. So, you know, cultivation is very important in renewal. And if anything, it will lift response rate by just telling your story and being truthful and honest and open with the mission you're charged with kind of getting out there. So on the next slide, this is my last example of cultivation. This took a little creativity on our part. We unfortunately were affected by Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and the magnitude 7.1 earthquakes in Mexico. In a matter of 14 days, 9 of our buildings were affected, and our Houston shelter actually will probably have to be leveled and rebuilt. So anybody who's a fundraiser knows that it is a challenge to do emergency appeals and then keep people engaged after it. Imagine 28 days straight of emergency appeals, one right after another. And then at the end of it, John Bon Jovi Soul Foundation decided to give us $25,000. And you can't say no to John Bon Jovi. But we were like, we can't go to this list again. We can't. We have to figure out something. And so what we decided to do was to get our CEO on the phone and host a town hall style phone call for anybody who had received the emergency appeals, whether you donated or not, just to give you an update, to share what was going on, talk about our kids, let them know what was going on with the buildings. Our staff had lost their houses. He really kind of spent an hour and a half on the phone talking to people, answering questions. The next day, we sent a follow-up email, and we went through the $25,000 match in around 10 hours. And we brought in an additional $48,000, having already gotten gifts from almost 60% of our files. So that extra effort it took to get that cultivation touch in there, to make donors feel valued and part of the solutions of our rebuilding, absolutely attributed to the success of the final match, which went out 28 days after the first storm hit. So one quick last example, this is from the African Wildlife Fund. They got a match from Candace Bergen for $50,000, and they decided before launching the match, they were going to put together an interactive quiz. And so before the first fundraising email went out, a series of emails went out encouraging people to take the quiz. And the quiz really, really connected them to the real life heroes in the field, protecting these majestic wild animals that were in danger of extinction. And by the time the first email went out for fundraising, they met the match in email 1 and actually had to scrap emails 2 and 3 because they were not needed. They had already made the match. They revised them slightly, but all that quiz, the interaction with the quiz absolutely affected the match and its response rate.
Great, thanks,
Amazing.
Carla. We're going to turn things over. These are some great examples. We're going to turn things over to Michael now, who's going to walk through some really great campaign examples that are much that are focused on engagement.
Thanks so much, Peter. In order to get started, I'd actually like to refer back to something that Carla alluded to just a couple of minutes ago. She was talking about this notion of engaging people in progression, and something that we think a lot about at Countable, this idea of engagement ladders. How do you give someone an opportunity to engage minimally, firstly perhaps as a consumer, more passively, then marginally actively, and ultimately sort of like give them more and more rungs for different ways to sort of exert their influence relative to the cause or initiative that you're supporting, and ultimately get them to that raise them to the status of that sort of super advocate that every organization hopes to cultivate. So that's exactly what Chelsea Handler, one of our partners, is hoping to do. Chelsea Handler is a comedian and an actress who's also incredibly active in the sort of civic and political space. And one of the things that she's been focusing on over the course of the past year or so, as she's actually put her professional career on hold, is activism more full time. And so we were connected with Chelsea Handler about 6 months ago, and she came to us and she effectively said, you know, I have this large audience, but right now they're passive consumers and they're only audience members who are engaging on Facebook. And I want to empower my audience members in order to do something a little bit more meaningful and invest more thoroughly in the causes or organizations that I care about, that I'm hoping to surface. And then that's not the end of the game, but ultimately I want to empower these individuals to become advocates in and of themselves and sort of spread the message that I'm trying to promote a little bit more broadly. And so that's how we've been partnering with Chelsea Handler ever since. So she's been using us and our engagement products in order to sort of create a movement beyond social media. This manifests in 2 ways in particular. Firstly, Chelsea Handler will come to us with different civic initiatives or movements that she's interested in, and then Countable will generate content for her. And this harks back to something that Peter was talking about a little bit earlier, and that we'll go into in just another couple of minutes: content creation, how Countable has begun to streamline that via our newsroom as a service. And then the second component of it is making all of that content actionable. So rather than just tweeting something out or posting on Facebook that, you know, Chelsea Handler is supporting candidate X, Amy McGrath, for Congress in Kentucky, or she's supporting these Emily's List candidates, or she's supporting this other civic initiative. Instead of just doing that, she's instead referring people to the content that we've generated for her that's all made actionable and has built-in opportunities for people to, firstly, contact relevant stakeholders in the public discourse in order to try to convey their own perspectives and in stories and try to help shift that narrative. And then secondly, create video messages that they send to Chelsea that Chelsea can then distribute more broadly in order to activate audiences far and wide. So the second example of an organization that we tend to work with is the International Justice Mission. They're a nonprofit advocacy organization that was founded in order to try to stymie slavery all throughout the world. And they, just a handful of months ago, were working on this campaign, which they called the Digital March to End Slavery. Now, they have a large list and they've done a really good job with audience development. But one thing that they haven't ever really facilitated was messaging from an audience member's perspective. Like Peter was talking about a little bit earlier, many of their advocacy campaigns and civic and donation campaigns previously had largely hinged on a sort of narrative voice, you know, on a storyteller. It's the organization reaching out to an individual. And instead, what they hoped to do for this campaign was collect user-generated content from individual supporters that could tell the story for them in 2 different ways. Firstly, to other audience members in order to broaden the scope of the scope of their messaging. And that's largely, I'd say, contingent upon changes that have been made algorithmically to Facebook and Twitter's news feeds over the course of the past couple of years. Organizations like IJM have come to realize that user-generated content and non-organizational content and rich media content tend to perform much better in terms of gaining a degree of organic virality than not. And so they were hoping to accrue video messages from supporters talking about this campaign and why it matters and the impact that it can have, and then share those videos out on social rather than sharing out posts that have been created by the organization proper. And then secondly, trying to translate that value into the legislative messaging and stakeholder messaging component of this, where rather than just sort of having text-based messages being sent to lawmakers, which are still important and can be efficacious, rather they wanted individuals to be able to show their own voices, lens their own, or search their own voices, show their own faces, and convey their messages in person to their lawmakers. Another example of a way that we've sort of helped facilitate audience engagement and deepen investment with an organizational partner is with an Inconvenient Equal. Some of y'all may have seen Al Gore's film that came out a handful of years ago called Inconvenient Truth, all about environmental protection and climate change and what we need to do in order to stem the growing risk of climate change. And so he produced and just pushed out to the public last July a sequel called An Inconvenient Equal. But one of the things that the movie, that the film team wanted to do in conjunction with Participant Media, which was one of the producers of the film, was not just provide a film that educated audience members, but rather sort of create a film and push out a film that not only educated, but offered people an opportunity to get involved more deeply with the initiatives that the film was all about and trying to advocate on. And that's where they called up Countable and where we began to lend a hand. The idea was don't just passively consume, but instead, after you go to the film, before you go to the film, during the film, oftentimes, at a handful of the different showings, they would empower individuals with Countable's products, which were intended to do not only the couple of things that we alluded to previously relative to Chelsea Handler and IJM, but something in addition to that too, which is cultivating a sense of community. An Inconvenient Equal leveraged Countable's product in order to create an action center or a home base that sort of served as a digital hub for education and action relative to climate change, a place where individuals who are interested in the film or who watch the film, where moviegoers could go after the fact in order to learn more, take deepened engagement, and really importantly, connect with other folks in the movement. See what other people were doing in order to get involved, see other people's perspectives, and learn collaboratively in that way. Not just taking action once by purchasing a ticket and going to the film, but taking action concertedly and repeatedly. Another example that I'll outline really quickly is the Human Rights Campaign. Something that Carla alluded to earlier about storytelling from an individual's perspective is exactly what the Human Rights Campaign, one of our partners, was attempting to do with their year-end donation campaign. The idea was we don't want to just send an email asking for another donation because donation fatigue is a real thing and engagement fatigue is a real thing. And they were interested in trying to adopt a different sort of narrative voice that also surfaced more social and communal value. So they leveraged Countable's video testimonial tool in order to firstly accrue videos about HRC, the value that being an HRC member provides, all of the good work that HRC has contributed. And then really importantly, they surfaced that video content in their donation appeals and on the web page proper. And then as soon as individuals donated, then they were prompted subsequently with an opportunity to surface why they donated, which was a really incredible way of sort of closing the feedback loop. So not only were you prompted with social proof in order to optimize the chance of donation at the top of the funnel, but subsequently folks were shown videos from other individuals in the community from other individuals in the community, and then prompted to record a video again themselves and share it with their community members. So let me hand it over to Peter for just another moment to talk a little bit about how valuable content and engagement opportunities can be made a little bit less intensive.
Thanks, Michael. And I just want to acknowledge we're at the top of the hour. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties as we were getting started. I think we have about 5 or 10 more minutes worth of material. Certainly, we want to respect people's time, and at least I personally won't feel bad if folks have to drop off as they head to other meetings. The content that we have downstream here is really focused on 2 things. One is how to develop this kind of content, and 2 is really just answering any questions that folks have or wanted to share with us. So I think we'll just be a few more minutes, but again, thank you guys for hanging in there. Quite frankly, as we've developed these programs over the last 5 years, as I mentioned before, the number one question I get from the folks managing the direct response budget at every organization where we've suggested this is, how do we do this without dramatically increasing costs? We're not a publisher. We don't write a lot of content. When we do write content or make videos, it's exceedingly expensive. And so the notion for them of trying to get that content into their direct response program, especially when it's not tied to a direct appeal, becomes a tough case to make. And so we have worked very hard to help folks come up with ways to develop content at the lowest possible amount of resources to be invested. The number one way that we've tried to help folks dip their toe in the water is to upcycle content. So in the example of the Seeing Eye, they've developed tons of programmatic content for helping their puppy raisers raise puppies. We developed that guide to taking care of your puppy by dusting off the content that they've developed for another audience and packaging it in a relatively low-cost manner into those PDFs and emails. Another good example is an organization that we work with that has a terrific direct mail acquisition piece. So they are sending out a map of all of the best sites and parks to visit in California. We've actually turned that into a PDF that people can download and that we make available using their Google grant for folks planning California vacations and those sorts of search terms to drive them onto the file. We deliver a ton of value to them by virtue of helping them plan a great vacation, and their affinity for the organization then downstream grows over time. The second way is curation. I think if you follow any, if you're spending any time on a social medium like Facebook or LinkedIn, you see a ton of curation, which is where Peter is about as lazy as he can be. He pulls up articles and shares other people's articles that say Corey or Carla or Michael have written. And so he's trying to deliver value by pushing forward interesting content. If you're going to focus on a curation-based strategy, it's really critical to make sure that as you share other people's content, that you're providing your own perspective on it. So as we share this guide to X, Y, and Z from some other organization, here's why we at my organization believe that it's really important for you to have access to. Certainly we see people get fatigued when the only thing that they ever see from an organization is just articles that other people have written that have been shared by on social or by email. User-generated content is actually a terrific opportunity to get your audience and your supporters to give you content to push forward. There's an organization that we work with that supports veterans, and the second message in the Welcome series is Tell Us About a Veteran, is focused on asking people to tell us about a veteran in their life who has made a difference either in their community or in their family or neighborhood. And so we basically have this perennial tool running that asks people to just click through, go to a little form, type in their story and share it with us. We republish the vast majority of those on the website, but then we also upcycle those into social posts. We look for opportunities to make really strong appeals, both in direct mail as well as through digital media. And then finally, the place where we feel like we've been tremendously innovative is by finding a partner like Countable, who is constantly writing content on probably 100 different issues. I believe if you go to countable.us/issues, you'll be able to see all of the content that they're producing. We are working with them to license at a very low cost the articles that they're writing. We take those articles and we turn them into, say, 5 or 6 different pieces of content. We will take the article that they've written and add an organization-specific introduction. So they might write an article about a bill that's moving through Congress or a community where folks are helping low-income older women get access to healthcare. We're taking that article, adding the organization's introduction and why it's important, and then driving it forward into a blog post, email message, as well as multiple Facebook posts. So we get the benefit of their very strong content team's output and turn that into stuff that works in a direct response program across many digital media. I'm going to stop talking there and then turn things back over to Michael to talk briefly about the way that they're doing that. And then we'll wrap up very shortly with just a few questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. So Countable focuses quite a bit on content, as has been alluded to. Not only for the sort of value inherent to it, but also because content paired with action, like we've talked about, has been the most efficacious way of driving civic action. So our content team is led by a journalist named Andrea Seabrook. She was formerly of NPR and Marketplace. She founded a really incredible podcast called Decode DC a handful of years ago, and she was a congressional correspondent on Capitol Hill for both NPR and Marketplace. She comes with really incredible journalistic chops, and not just thinking about how to tell stories in creative ways, but really how to tell stories from a citizen's perspective in a way that tends to resonate with individual audience members. I'd say the core to our, one thing I'd say is pretty core to our content team's philosophy is distilling messages down and conveying value with relatable and memorable language. So the way we actually got started doing this way back when, and this is still a core part of the business, though we've expanded quite a bit over the course of the past handful of years, is we would start by taking federal legislation or statewide legislation and then distilling that down. I don't know how many folks on the line have ever read a piece of legislation, but I have a master's in international relations, and I can't get through it. I mean, it is so full of legalese and in language that is just not readily understandable. It's nearly impossible to understand, and it's certainly impossible to feel anything for. So we got started by distilling down legislation into sixth grade language, putting it sort of framing it from the perspective of an individual citizen. What's the cost summary? What's the impact summary? Why should I vote for it? Why should I vote against it? What's the CBO score, the Congressional Budget Office score, that sort of thing? And that's how we really began to sort of sharpen our teeth on this about 4 years ago. And then about 3 years ago, we began moving into content more broadly and writing up different pieces of relevant civic content that are applicable to everyday life, akin to what Peter was talking about a little earlier, trying to help solve problems for people and conveying the information that people are looking for in a way that can really answer the question for them seamlessly. So we surface this content in a couple of different ways. As Peter was alluding to, one of the things that the content team spends a lot of time on is our newsroom as a service, but this manifests in two ways in particular. Firstly, we produce content that is leveraged directly or licensed directly to our partners for broadcasting via their different channels and existing mediums. They can post on their own websites, they can post on social, they can publish in conjunction with press releases, etc. And the content is, for all intents and purposes, entirely theirs. Alternatively, there is a product that Countable has developed in order to centralize, I'd say, digital education and action taking. And this is one of the central ways that our partners tend to go about leveraging Countable's produced content. And that's what we call the Action Center. So the Action Center is a hosted platform that allows for the publishing of individual content and, as we'll talk about in just a moment, the reposting of individual content. And it's totally partner branded, and it looks and feels like your own website. You just don't have to build it, and you don't have to maintain it. Countable does that for you. And so this is what that experience looks like here, where it's really easy to go into the back end content manager and create content of your own volition. Similarly, we make it incredibly easy for our partners to sift through all of the issues and individual pieces of content that Peter was alluding to just a couple of minutes ago, identify the content that they like and that's most relevant to their business, and then just simply repost it to their own profile. Alternatively, they can have members of the Countable team go through, identify that content, and then send it along to them. So with that sort of operational bit, let me hand it back over to Peter to talk for just a moment about what's next.
Yeah, so as we wrap things up here, Michael, if you could jump to the next slide. Really, these are the key components of applying these things today. The first is to really take a look at your audience, make sure you understand what's going on in their lives. There are a number of tools you can use to identify who the visitors to your website are, or the fans of your Facebook page, or even those folks who are on your email file, understanding what their lifestyles look like and their household composition. Really taking a look at those things enable us to make good decisions about what is interesting to them. Certainly delivering an audience survey is really important to understanding what's important and interesting as well. Second, really take a hard look at your program as you evaluate what's going on. Maybe ask your friends and family, right? People who you'd be okay getting good criticism from, but would you, if you were receiving the emails from your organization, feel like you're delivering enough value to convince folks to support the organization? Obviously, you want to develop a plan. We recommend looking at testing into this kind of thing. So maybe as you look at your, fall campaign to raise money, or maybe your welcome series, look at incorporating more cultivation content into that program and seeing how it performs over time. And then finally, create that content, whether you upcycle or curate or license content. You've got to get the content from somewhere. And my recommendation is, of course, to pick the low-hanging fruit and save as much money as you can for those downstream appeals and other more intense direct response activities. And then finally, don't forget to engage folks. Shoving content at people is never the greatest idea unless it is the most valuable content on the planet, like how to pick the lottery numbers or select the highest performing stocks. Quite frankly, asking people to do things, whether it's taking an action by writing to Congress, signing a pledge to make a change in their lives, or even commenting on a Facebook post, become really valuable engagement points over time. I think that's just about all we had time to cover today. I don't know if there are any critical questions, Corey, or if you want to wrap things up. Let's just see where we are.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So we had a couple of questions roll in, and I'll send them out to you and Michael here, and we'll answer them. And then, if anyone else has any questions that come up while we're talking through these, please feel free to share them. First one, can you tell us about the return on investment when you've used these kinds of things for lead generation?
Sorry, Corey, you cut out for a second. Can you say that again?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Can you tell us about the return on investment when you've used these kinds of things for lead generation?
Yeah, for sure. So we have studied folks over time that have come onto programs by signing up, and I'll use one example here, through a number of different ways. We've seen people, we compared for one organization the performance of consumers who signed up to receive email through, say, just the footer on the website or the email sign-up page. Those are kind of the organic leads. We also enticed people to sign up through a contest through a corporate partner where people were uploading pictures of their dogs and voting, and the organization got their names that way. We also, at the same time, had people sign a petition. So we worked with one of the advocacy pledge providers out there to gather about 10,000 names. And then we brought a ton of people in through a dog cancer prevention kit, that info type product that I described at the beginning of the presentation. For that organization, we saw really strong performance in all of those 4 names in terms of the average gift and the frequency of giving. The organic people performed the best. The petition people performed, I think, least well. And then in between were the info product driven leads. The info product driven leads, where we solved that problem of giving someone a couple of extra years with their dog, by virtue of them detecting cancer and getting it treated early, actually performed at $1.89 after 18 months. So for every dollar they put into the program, 18 months later, they saw $1.89 out. So of course, that's just a single example, but we see these types of results really across the board as we compare lead source information. I think the critical thing is making sure that your creative costs stay low. So, if you're not sure whether or not an information product is going to really hit with your audience, if they don't give you good insight, the issue becomes making sure that as you test into it, you're using lower cost creative than higher cost things as you get started with the program.
Yeah, thank you. Next question, how do you integrate these kinds of programs with direct mail campaigns?
I'll just keep talking. Carla and I have been working on a program here with an organization. I think I talked a little bit earlier about them. They're an organization that supports California state parks. One of the things that they had done is actually develop that direct mail acquisition piece, which they would mail out to their rented lists, asking people to give, but also delivering to them a map of the parks and the high-level attributes. Our program manager, Miranda, last year worked with them to give that thing an overhaul in terms of its look and feel. And now we use that as an information product that we ask people to download. We advertised it primarily through their Google grant, but certainly could drive people to that thing from their website and email as well. I would say, too, that we've had some really good experience taking people who've come in through a Google Ad Grant driven program like that Cancer Kit or this State Parks Guide. We take those names and put them into direct mail acquisition. So when someone signs up to receive that guide, we will take those names, obviously the ones with postal address, and mail them the direct mail acquisition package. And we've seen some really strong performance there. In a number of cases, we've seen names that have come in through these programs perform better than a 1% response rate, which is solid in the world of direct mail acquisition. So we see these programs supporting each other in both directions.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask one final question here, and then I'm going to advance the slide as well so that people can see our contact information in case they want to ask any follow-up questions afterwards. Where is it here? Yep. How much additional staff time does something like this typically require?
So I can take a stab at that one. It's actually incredibly seamless to integrate. The thing is that not only does the engagement products that Countable tends to work in conjunction with partners with, are they really easily embedded? There's no real integration process, so it doesn't take a long time to onboard or get up and running. Most of our products are really a sort of simple exercise in copy and paste. So as long as there's someone who's managing the CMS or website, it doesn't take very long at all to sort of get up and running with the different engagement products. In terms of, integrating it into the sort of ongoing operations of daily workflow, I'd say that we tend to have a couple of onboarding calls with our partners in order to think through best practices and the ways that these sorts of initiatives and actionable content and value-driven content can best be included and sort of dropped into the flow, but dropped into the flow. But it doesn't take very long at all in order to actually move forward with that. Once we sort of go through the onboarding process, it's really a sort of simple matter of individuals baking it in. It's another thing to think about, but doesn't take very much time. And then the final thing I'd allude to is the content component of things. Like Peter was alluding to a little bit earlier, we really make an effort to make sure that all of the content is produced in-house by Countable and readily licensed out to our partners. So the only place where our partners have to exert any sort of effort at all is up front in initial sort of content collaboration meeting with someone from the Countable team, where we walk through the different types of content that are most pertinent, most relevant, where we establish a direct line of communication between someone at the partner on the partner team and then someone on Countable's team, and make sure that they're able to collaborate on any sort of immediate or quick turnaround pieces of content that need to be produced. But save for that, Countable has its directives from the get-go and is producing relevant content and then surfacing that content for our partners for them to be able to promote pretty immediately. So there's no real sort of back-end time that needs to be spent on content creation or curation.
Great, Michael. Thank you so much for answering that. And Peter, Carla, thank you guys both for taking time out of your day to talk us through this. At this point, we're going to wrap up the webinar. We are constantly refining this presentation. So we'd like to follow up with each of you to hear your thoughts on it. And we'd like to see if this is something that you'd be interested in exploring for your organization. In the meantime, though, if you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask or that come up to you later on as you're thinking through this stuff, feel free to reach out to any of our experts directly. You can see their email addresses and phone numbers up here on the slide. So thank you very much. We hope that everybody else enjoys the rest of your afternoon. Take care.